Hello, everyone, and welcome to my channel. Today, we're recording podcast style with my friend Mike, who is joining us today because he wrote an excellent paper about if the SSPX is a cult. And it's about 32 pages. I thought, oh man, that's going to take me some time to read, but it's really kind of gripping. So I got in there and I was reading, and page after page, I just couldn't wait for the next page. So you're definitely going to want to read that paper after you watch this video. But we thought for those of you who have a hard time sitting down and reading or feel like you don't have that much time, we wanted to give you an overview of that in our conversation today, and just anything else that kind of comes up that plays into that same theme. And so anyway, thank you so much for coming on today, Mike. It's wonderful to have you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the opportunity. This means a lot, and I'm really looking forward to getting the word out there about this, because I think it's something that a lot of people very easily say. We'll get into the details, but one of the reasons I wrote this was because you hear a lot of people saying the SSPX is a cult, right? And
Right.
when you hear it just dropped casually in conversation, at least for me, I always thought, maybe they had a bad experience, or maybe they had some emotional damage or something to that effect with this group. But then once I started doing some research and looking into what actually constituted a cult, it's not quite as dramatic as maybe some might think, or at least that I thought. So I am very grateful that I'm able to share this information and maybe help some people.
Yeah, I think that's awesome too. And it's so true, because I have yet to meet someone who has left the SSPX and would not agree with me that it's very cultish. And that's telling. I mean, if you need to know something is a cult, you don't go talk to somebody who's in the thick of it, because of course they're going to deny it because they don't want to be labeled like that and avoided. And so it's the people that have been through it, especially those who didn't choose it for themselves but were born into it, and they're just telling their honest experience and what it compares to, and that's always what comes out of it. So I think it's definitely worth going into, because if people aren't informed, they're going to stumble into the same situation and not really be prepared for what is going to happen to them.
Right. I think it would behoove us to listen to those who have experienced it firsthand and who have left over the years, especially with those who have been with them since the beginning and know what their roots are like, and the principles on which they were founded. Right. So
Right.
I thought it would be good to get firsthand experience rather than, you can find resources or threads or message boards online talking about this stuff, as we'll get into, but firsthand reports and firsthand accounts are much more valuable. So that's the kind of the approach that I took with this.
Right. Yeah. If you wanted to tell us just a little bit more about how you wrote the paper, and, what kind of spurred you to realize that this was a bigger issue than you thought at first.
Sure. So for some brief background, I do have a lot of history with the SSPX. My family has a lot of history with the SSPX. I have a pretty extensive family who are all, they've been involved with it for decades. So I'm definitely speaking from experience here. And like I said, I'd heard it called a cult in a lot of interviews and a lot of from people airing their grievances with it, right? And I kind of dismissed it because, at least for me, when I hear the word cult, I think of the more extreme kinds, like Waco or like Jonestown or the Moonies, right? These kind of very, very radical ones. And I thought, okay, well, the SSPX isn't out here committing mass suicide or anything like that. So it didn't seem to really be on the same par, I guess. But then, as I said, I started doing some research. I started actually looking into it a little bit. I said, okay, let's see if there's any validity to these claims. And what I found was very surprising, because characteristics of cults are not quite as, it doesn't have to be that extreme, right? The cults are often more subtle than that. And their main characteristic really is or they're mainly characterized by groups or individuals who offer promises of some kind of fulfillment or meeting your needs in some way, right? But they achieve this meeting your needs by coercion and manipulation and authoritarianism. They institute complete dependence on them and on the group, right? So
Yeah.
it wasn't quite as extreme as that. So one definition that I found on a cult experts website here, which really opened up my eyes and made me do some more digging. This is Dr. Leona Fernari, and her definitions is a cult is a group or movement exhibiting great or excessive devotion or dedication to some person, idea, or thing, employing unethical, manipulative, or coercive techniques of persuasion and control, which can include isolation from former friends and family, debilitation, use of special methods to heighten suggestibility and subservience, powerful group pressures, information management, suspension of individuality or critical judgment, and promotion of total dependency on the group and fear of leaving the group. I read that definition and it hit me like a ton of bricks. I said, that is it. She's describing the SSPX 100%. And
right.
It really opened up my eyes. I had never read just a straightforward definition or seen it summarized that way. Like I said, I'd always thought of them as the more extreme kind, but once I read these things and started doing some more research, I said, okay, this really needs to be told. People need to know about this. As you know, there's a big influx of people into the Catholic traditionalist movement, especially over, I don't know if the last decade is too long, but especially over the last 5, 6, 7 years. And
right.
for all these people who are just trying to find a Latin mass, and they couldn't care less what group is running it. They just want this nice liturgy.
Right.
But I think they really should know about the problems with especially with this group, and some of the characteristics that define the SSPX I think are definitely present in other ones as well. That's not the main topic of our conversation today, but
yeah.
I saw all of these things in the SSPX from my experience, from friends' experience, from family experience, all these kinds of things. And I thought this needs to be shared. So what I did was I took some criteria that I had found from major cult studies organizations. The first one is the International Cultic Studies Association. The other was the Cult Education Institute. They have lists of what defines a cult, the characteristics of a cult, the characteristics of a problematic group or leader. Obviously, a lot of those overlapped. So what I did was I put these criteria in a survey, and I sent this survey out to people who had left the SSPX. There were a couple of Facebook groups of people who had left. I have some friends and family who have left. I sent it to a pretty large number of people. And so I would say, here's the first one. Here's the first criteria. Does this accurately describe the SSPX from your experience? Laura, I was.
Yeah.
Well, I should say I was shocked, but I really wasn't, because I was expecting this answer. But almost universally, from quite a large number of people, almost universally across the board, they said yes. There was one or two maybe points that they didn't agree with, which I can explain later. One off the top of my head I know is one characteristic of a cult is that they will try to recruit people very diligently. They're all about recruitment and bolstering their numbers and such. The general response about that one from people was that no, actually the SSPX tends to kind of hunker down and looks at outsiders suspiciously. So with one or two exceptions like that, almost everything else they answered yes across the board. There was one respondent who messaged me after she went through the survey, and she said the SSPX is 1000% occult based on the survey.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So I said, this needs to be compiled. This needs to be shared. I need to get this word out to people. Your channel has been also very useful in hearing personal stories, and I relied on some of those for some support on a lot of these points. And I just thought that, yeah, this message needed to be shared. I know it's a pretty direct message, and in all the resources that you'll read, the cult experts will say the number one thing you don't want to do to try to convince someone is tell them, hey, you're in a cult. And so this one, I understand this is probably not really going to get through to people who are in there. This was mainly written for people who are considering joining them or who are considering leaving them and maybe need some kind of support in their decision. I really, really would ask of those who are in, even if you've discounted this discussion already based on the title or based on the content, really, please, I would ask you to hear me out and hear us out and just go through it to just to see everything, just to know, so that it's just so that you're able to see people's feedback, people's firsthand experience. One cult expert, Stephen Hassan, that I used in my research, said that ex-members of a group are a great source of information, and if you want to know more about that group, you should look for an ex-member's written account or video account or some kind of feedback. And that's exactly what we've provided here, is firsthand experience from people who have been in it for decades, people who really know and who have seen the problematic side of it, right? This isn't people who have joined them in the last 2-3 years and who are still kind of in the traditionalist honeymoon stage, if you will. So
right. Well, that's something that came up in a recent video I did with a women's panel. We talked about how a lot of the my friends, ex-trad people I know, their parents were raised in the Novus Ordo or, Protestantism or something. They're formed adults, and then they choose traditionalism or the society for their families with small children, and then their children are just exposed to this environment. They have no choice in it, of course. Then they're just raised knowing nothing else, and so when they grow up and they start, like, things kind of come in and they make them question what they've always thought and been told, and then they have these experiences, sometimes very traumatizing experiences, actually frequently, that happens to people, and then they're like, something's really wrong and I've got to get some distance from this. And then from the outside, they look back and they're like, wow, like, the world I didn't know could be like this, I was shut out from it. I mean, we compared it to that movie The Village, because there actually are quite a few parallels, because the premise of that movie was that the elders of the town had experienced terrible things in their lives, and they wanted to create a community where everything was idyllic and peaceful and there wouldn't be crime and pain and all this stuff. So they had to shut out the outside world and also put everyone in the town in fear of the outside world so that they wouldn't even try to leave. But then terrible things end up happening anyway, because you just can't stop it. And in this weird isolated environment, cut off from the wider reality, it almost was more more unbalanced in a way. And so, the inevitable happens and they have to go to the outside world to get help, and it just kind of plays out to show what happens. And it's very telling. And yeah, it's like, so I could see people taking that comment of Hassan's about learning from ex-members and be like, well, you'll hear all kinds of terrible things about the Catholic Church when you talk to fallen away Catholics, like, that's not a good way to get information. But in this case, I don't think that's a direct parallel. Maybe, you can speak to that too, because I just think that any old fallen away Catholic who usually left the church because they were never formed in it or whatever, but it's like, they're usually not raised with very much religion in their life. They're usually pretty secularized. And so their experience of the church is really not accurate or not complete. And so they may have beefs against it. They may not. They just may not have any feelings at all. But when it comes to these other groups that are they have such intense indoctrination and these very particular regulated environments, like in the society, you have something else going on here. And that's something that anybody can recognize, whether they're, well catechized Catholics or not. I don't know if you would have any more comments on that, because I could just hear the objections in my mind when I read that line. I thought, I know what he's saying is true, but I can hear people trying to dismiss that comment.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that. And I did look into that when I was trying to find what defines a cult versus what defines a religion. I did look that up and try to find what it was that the experts saw as a difference between the two. It's a bit of a lame answer I'm just going to say it briefly, but the characteristics they put as a cult, they basically just said, yeah, all of these problematic things you won't find in long established religion, right? So all of these very particular behaviors about, for example, you're not allowed to ask questions in a cult. You're not allowed to question their methods. You're not allowed to question their ideology, right? I mean, the
Yeah.
Catholic Church welcomes questions, welcomes, you know,
Yeah.
trying to find
Further
out the
inquiry.
answers, and
Yeah.
right, more further inquiry and trying to deepen your understanding of everything, right? In a cult, for example, the you know, being controlled by shame and guilt. I mean, you can find strands of that, in more extreme groups in the Catholic Church, but the church as a whole, as an institution, absolutely doesn't do that, right? So
Right. Right.
yeah, these things are not present in long established religion, and all the cult experts will tell you, these are not things that we see as consistent problems in major religions like Christianity, right? You can get people who twist it into their own meaning, who twist it to their own ends, and that's kind of what we've got going on here. But as an institution, as a whole, that we don't see that. So that's kind of what I gathered from my research on that part. Yeah.
That's cool. And in the research, the little that I have done about, cults and whether that can be correlated to these traditionalist groups outside of the church, that again, the people that I was reading their criteria in these organizations, they're not anti-Christian, they're not anti-church, like you just said. They don't consider long established religion to be a problem. It's these more recent spin-off groups, these little sects that pop up, and it's kind of like this flare, and then there's these problematic situations that occur as a result, and people get burned out, and it can be really bad. I mean, doesn't Rick Allen Ross, he has another name for cult group, something like organized destructive groups or something like that. And I was like, yeah,
Okay.
that's very applicable to the SSPX, because all you have to do is sit back and watch how many people come out of them with their lives just upside down. They are trying to find equilibrium and they get into drugs, they are just totally hedonistic lifestyles, or they commit suicide, or the abuse rates and the incest and these other problems that are very concentrated for what a small group it is. It's like, that's really, yeah, that makes you kind of pause and go, okay, we're dealing with something different. You'll find this in little places everywhere, but it's very concentrated in traditionalism.
Yes. On the topic of Rick Allen Ross, who, like you said, is the Cult Education Institute's executive director, he said that, I quote him in my paper, he says the SSPX is an extremely controlling and legalistic group, very extreme. He does cite an unnamed American cult expert who said the SSPX is, this person said, it's a group I've had very, very serious complaints about. I should say that the International Cultic Studies Association does not maintain a running list of problematic groups on their website, and they have a page explaining why. The Cult Education Institute does, and guess who's on that list? The SSPX has quite it's a database. Admittedly, and I'll be fair here, there are a number of those articles that reference issues with Bishop Williamson and his Holocaust denial nonsense, and older stuff that is not necessarily affiliated with them anymore. But not all of it is like that. There is other content that is should alert readers that it is problematic. So I can go down the
it's on their radar. That's good to know. They've named them and posted it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. It has been on this group's radar for decades, and we'll see that there are good reasons for that.
Awesome. Well, I don't want to derail you, so I know you have a bunch of feedback from your surveys to share and kind of get us into the individual points. So I'm excited about that.
Sure. So I will go down the list here of the 12 main points that I took from both groups. I believe the ICSA's list was between 15 and 18 points, and then the Cult Education Institutes was, I think, 10 or 11. So there are some that are specific to one group. Most of them overlap. But I'll list them all right off the bat, and then we'll go down the line here. So there are, these are the points that we're going to be discussing. It is unquestioning commitment to the leader or the group, not allowed to ask questions. The group is always right. The group always has the answers, and they're always correct. There's an us versus them mentality, or a fear or rejection of the outside world, or like you're describing in the parallels with that movie, The Village, it's the dangers of the outside world. There is no accountability for the group. There is a fear of leaving and shunning those who do leave, even family and friends. They're disconnected from their acquaintances. Followers are controlled by shame and guilt. There are similar experiences from former members. They all attest to the same problematic behaviors. The occult will say that the ends justify the means. They have an elitist mentality. There are records of historical abuse for these groups, and the leadership of the group dictates the rules in great detail. So these are the criteria that we're going to be looking at today. And I want to add one quick introductory note, because a lot of your content, and I know there's a lot of other great content that you've recommended before that talks about the issues with the SSPX as it relates to the church as a whole, in terms of their canonical discrepancies, their faulty ecclesiology, all these kinds of things. This is not going to get into that for a couple of reasons. Number one, I'm just a layperson. I'm not a theologian. I'm not a canon lawyer. I don't have expertise in here, and so I don't have really a leg to stand on. But also, I found that it's very, very hard to reach people with that kind of content, right? You can show them quotes and canons and all kinds of compelling evidence. I mean, declarations from popes. There's one of their crisis videos, they present that quote from Pope Benedict XVI, where he said the SSPX's ministers do not exercise legitimate ministries in the church. I mean, that's about as much a blanket statement as you can get. And then they proceed to say, well, that doesn't really count, though. We actually do, because crisis, right? You can't reach these people with that argument, or saying, one thing that never ceases to amaze me is when they rely on the "we are not in schism" argument, which I'm not going to get into whether or not they are. That's not the time or place for it. But what amuses me is how they'll say that everything they do, they see as okay because they're quote unquote not in schism, based on a cardinal or a bishop who happens to look at them favorably. And I want to say to them, whether or not you are technically legally in schism doesn't excuse your behavior, right? Even if you're not in schism, you still can't set up churches wherever you feel like. You still can't send priests to minister wherever they feel like. You still can't establish seminaries and schools wherever you feel like. Whether or not you're in schism has no bearing on that. So it's a losing argument. I'm reminded of that meme template from Jurassic Park, where the character is saying they're so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think about if they should. Right? Everyone is so intent on figuring out or reconciling quotes or competing statements. They're so intent on trying to figure out whether or not they legally can attend the SSPX. They don't stop to think about whether or not it's a good idea. And my hope with this paper is to kind of lean into that latter section and say, it's not a good idea, even if you've mentally reconciled the canonical irregularities, right? So that's kind of my preamble to all this. So we'll go down the list here. I've got it open here. Okay, so the first one here, unquestioning commitment to the leader or group. Some former adherents have said, being raised in the SSPX, my parents never considered anything to be true or good if it didn't come from Lefebvre or his priests, right? They said you never criticize in any way, shape, or form their founder, and you never speak poorly of their priests unless you want to find yourself shunned by other members. That ties into one of our other points. Someone said, we were taught that
Yeah.
Lefebvre was chosen by God. He was a modern day Noah, if you will, protecting the very few chosen in the ark of the SSPX, right? So I'll start this one by saying it's funny to me that the SSPX has a section on, they have a whole webpage called Responding to False Accusations. And one of them, the accusation is that they're occult, and they have this response as to whether or not they're occult. And ironically, I think their response shows how that they are. It's a very, I think it backfired on them, because they say in their response of whether or not they're occult, let me pull up the actual quote here. They make a show about how, oh, we're simply Roman Catholics, we simply follow the faith and the tradition, etc. And then they go on to say, if the faithful who attend the mass centers operated by the society, because unfortunately the faithful cannot go to their own local parish due to the infection of modernism and the dangers of the new mass, if they adhere to the SSPX, it is because they recognize that the priests offer them the church's true doctrine and sacraments without any compromise with modernism.
Wow.
So in their responses to whether or not they're a cult, they say, no, we're not a cult. We just provide the true doctrine and the true sacraments, and we don't have any compromise with the church. We are the source of truth, essentially. I don't know how they see this as a good answer. It's a really bad answer. So they say that they're the source of truth in the church, that anything outside of their boundaries is compromised. They, any other traditionalist group like the fraternity or the institute, since they've accepted Vatican II, they've compromised. They literally see themselves as this kind of, the unblemished remnant, right? Like, we don't have any error, we're free of all of the nonsense in the church today. Come to us, we have the true doctrine and sacraments. I'm quoting them there. We have the church's true doctrine and sacraments, right?
Right.
Again, to quote Stephen Hassan, he says, the cult's doctrine allows no outside group to be recognized as valid or good or godly or real, because that would threaten the cult's monopoly on truth, right? They don't recognize any outside group as any good. You can't go to the fraternity. You can't go to the institute. You most definitely can't go to your local church, the Novus Ordo. They see anything outside of them as compromised, right? They think that, Marcel Lefebvre saved the Mass. He's responsible for saving the Latin Mass and the Church. There's a great quote here from a former SSPX priest who wrote and publicized a letter when he left. And he said, another unusual quality of the society is its adherence in matters of faith and morals to the opinions of its founder. They said in their work about explaining the legitimacy and scope of their marriage tribunals, they said, the authority of our founder suffices for us to accept these instances, the same way we've accepted the episcopal consecrations of 1988. This former priest also says, we find in our ranks that such and such an opinion is held because Archbishop Lefebvre held it. They see this man as untouchable. He can do no wrong in their eyes, essentially.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing. It's quite an amazing statement of faith in someone who doesn't have the guarantee of infallibility.
Yeah. And they even say, I mean, just read the wording. They say, adherence to the opinions of its founder. Opinion. You can't run your faith based on opinion. You have to submit to an authoritative magisterium. You can't run based on an opinion. It doesn't make any sense.
It's biblical too, because in the Bible, I think it's in one of the Psalms, it says, put no trust in princes, in mortal men in whom there is no help. It's like your trust has to be in God and in him manifesting himself through the proper channels, but that has to carry the authority that he established to guarantee that it will be intact. And just any old Joe Blow cleric running around is not guaranteed to be 100% reliable, especially not in all of his opinions. I mean, holy cow.
Exactly. And I mean, you can find many quotes from saints who say, if a priest approaches you and says, submit yourself to my authority, you are obliged to refuse him unless he is authorized and sent by the church, unless he is authorized by a legitimate authority to minister to you, right? So if a society priest comes to you and says, I'm now in charge of shepherding your soul, You say, were you sent by the local bishop? Were you sent by the lawful authority? If the answer is no, then absolutely not. I will not submit to you.
Right.
But in their eyes, he is untouchable. I know for a fact they have a very large picture of him displayed up in the vestibule of the Immaculata. But as far as I know, I don't know if they have a picture of the Pope in there.
Isn't there a statue of him on the front of the church too?
There is a statue of Archbishop Lefebvre on the front of their church. It's right in front of the entrance. I mean, you have a man who died excommunicated from the Catholic Church, memorialized in stone on the front of your church.
Yeah,
I don't see how that's not problematic. It's kind of amazing.
Right. Well, because it just shows it's a perfect illustration of that their judgment reigns supreme, because if they judge that he was not guilty as the church judged him to be, then they'll exalt him all day long and say, Saint Marcel Lefebvre, pray for us, which is very common too. And because the church's opinion doesn't matter, because they've left the church, they've started their own church.
Right. The post-conciliar church, right?
Yeah. Right.
So So
awesome.
Yes. So then number 2, about not allowed to ask questions, or questioning and dissent are discouraged or even punished, right? So a couple of statements from former adherents. One person said, questioning, doubt, and dissent were considered equivalent to heresy or blasphemy, since they necessarily indicated a lack of faith. The quickest way to get labeled rebellious in the SSPX was to voice concerns about any of their teachings. Someone said, to ask questions or to question authority is in itself a sign of disrespect and disobedience and considered evidence of a rebellious heart. Someone else said, let's see here. They talk about how obedience was held up as the highest virtue for the students and for the families and their communities, somehow missing that they exist only because of disobedience. The irony is very thick there. So this one, you can't ask any questions. You can't wonder about their methods or their ideology, right? Father Dwight Longnecker has a good article on cults. He says that complete loyalty is demanded of the followers, and those who dissent will be marginalized, will be demonized. They'll be isolated and given a name, maybe called the dissenters or the grumblers. I know for a fact, I've heard from several people that they have heard they've heard families or individuals be labeled the dissenters in their communities, right? Because they ask questions.
Right.
A good, also a quotation from, the ICSA has a book called Wounded Faith, Understanding and Healing from Spiritual Abuse. I also use that as a good resource for this paper. They said that cultic and abusive churches want to suppress questions and critical thinking, which they do by falsely equating doubts and questions with rebellion. That says it all right there to me, right? You're not allowed to ask any questions. Like I said, the irony that they only exist because of disobedience, and yet they demand unquestioning obedience from their followers.
Right.
That's some pretty thick irony.
Well, you reference this later in the paper when you say there's a quasi-Gnosticism at work here, where it's like not everyone is allowed free access to all the answers and information. They're actually positively discouraged from seeking answers and information past what they're just fed from the pulpit or in direct communication with a clergy member who's controlling what information goes out. And it's like there's this, the elite that has the full knowledge and rationale, and you're expected to just be this party person that ascribes to their will and follows their instructions, and that should be enough for you. But that's actually asking you to give up some of your freedom and the good mind that God gave us, through which we come to know him better and better. It's like they're saying, stop, you come no further. That's enough for you. But somebody is deciding that. And it's not God. It's not the church. It's somebody who's getting in the way.
Right. They discourage engaging with any material that might cause people to question their ideology, right? There is another comment on this paper about a woman who had a book. I believe it was actually the Pope, the Council, and the Mass, which has been recommended on your channel before, and a priest told her not to read it because it saw Vatican II in a favorable light. It took it condemned the position of the SSPX. It defended the council and the magisterium, and she was told not to read it. You hear this all the time, where they are told not to engage with books and figures and people who represent the church as it is today, because they might be, tainted with modernism or whatever. Right? You can only read or engage with stuff that is supportive of the quote unquote pre-conciliar church.
It's shrouded in language that makes it sound like we're telling you this for your own good because we want to protect the integrity of your faith. But it's like, if your faith was as strong as it ought to be, you should be able to encounter a little bit of an alternative perspective and not be completely undone. I mean, how did the gospel ever get spread to the world? The apostles would never have done it if that was their approach. Like, we can't talk to those people. They might infect us with their error. It's like, no, the light of Christ shines in the darkness and it overcomes the darkness. And that's the point, is that you have to share and you have to not be afraid, because if you just hunker down in fear, you're not evangelizing and you're not growing to the fullness that you were meant to grow to.
Exactly. I know of someone told me that her parents were told by an SSPX priest to burn their catechism, the 1992 Catechism of the Catholic Church. He told them to burn their copy of it.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. We can't engage with anything that might cause you to question our narrative, right? It's kind of amazing.
Yeah.
Wow. So number 3 here, about how the group is always right. The ICSA describes it as mind-altering practices that are used to suppress doubts about the group and its leaders. So a couple of points of feedback. One person said, as we were just talking about, the control of information helped with this. They said discouraging people from discouraging people from certain things, making outside information sinful, etc. One person said there is continued fear-mongering of hell, shaming, and demand from perfection from the earliest ages. This one really was, I had to put this in. They said, spying and interrogation tactics have been employed to use followers to reveal the wrongdoings of other followers, all while being told they're doing something good. Someone said, the tactic of outside the SSPX, there is no salvation, they said, is a very real tactic that worked to keep young minds from questioning. They said, this made me so sad. They said, telling a child that their doubts are equivalent to nailing Jesus to the cross with their own hands is devastating. That was devastating for me to read too. I can't believe there are people out here telling young children these things.
Yeah.
That's
my gosh.
That is so much for a young mind to handle.
Well, and I've talked to people, especially from St. Mary's, who grew up there, and they were just afraid, so afraid when they started having doubts and thinking that they needed to go to confession to the diocesan priest and maybe try the Novus Ordo, because maybe they'd been wrong about it all their lives. They were just so afraid of people seeing them going into the church and talking about it among the other town members, and what they would have to face as repercussions in their families if people found out they were going. So they'd try to sneak in the back and be all secretive, because they were just, it's a kind of a small community. And so everybody finds things out pretty fast, but they're literally spying on you. They're watching, and then they'll go tell people, oh, guess what just happened? Guess what I found out? Who I saw where? And then it's all over. And yeah, so it's definitely a very powerful deterrent.
Yeah, the group pressure is a real thing, and that's one of our later points that we'll talk about. But yeah, it's keeping everyone in line, keeping everyone aligned to the cause, right? And if you deviate at all, you're like the previous point said, you're shunned, right? That book again, Wounded Faith, it says, abusive churches and cults do not teach their members to tolerate diversity of opinion. Instead, they insist that there is one way, their way, and that all other views are simply wrong. I've seen a lot of SSPX material, as is probably obvious, that they describe everything as traditional, right? Everything must be traditional. Everything must be, in their response about whether or not they occult, they say they claim to follow the faith as expressed in tradition, right? That's their lens that they judge everything through. But the funny thing is,
right?
Okay, so what does tradition mean? And then they say that the church is wrong on what her interpretation of tradition means. So they're deferring to their own judgment on the criteria by which other things are judged. They're ultimately the authority here, right? I mean, Pope John Paul II in Ecclesia Dei, with his declaration about the excommunications, he said it's impossible to remain faithful to the tradition while breaking the ecclesial bond with him, to whom, in the person of the Apostle Peter, Christ himself entrusted the ministry of unity in his church. I mean, I know they've issued a refutation here saying, no, he doesn't understand tradition. I know there's a letter from Pope Paul VI to Lefebvre explaining how he has a warped understanding of tradition. This is the catalyst for, or the hinge for all their arguments, is whether or not it's traditional, right? And this is a good segue into Stephen Hassan's diagnostic tool called the BITE model, which I believe is linked on your website, the behavior, information, thought, and emotional control model. One of the things on here, which I thought was very interesting, he says, cults will use loaded language and cliches which stop critical thoughts and reduce complexities into buzzwords or into catchphrases, right? And if you've hung around the traditionalist circles long enough, you will hear all the buzzwords, right? The pastoral council, quo primum, it's a Protestant mass, the Freemasons, Rome will lose the faith, all these things. And they just say these things over and over and over, and they don't engage in critical conversation or maybe admit to the fact that not all of these things are correct. I've done copious amounts of research. They're built on sand, right? These things are not accurate. They're not things that should be guiding your spiritual decisions. But they will cite these things left and right and just stay in this cocoon of safety, right? I know I've heard from people that at St. Mary's Academy, they've had to answer questions like pop quiz questions, like, is the new Mass Catholic? Or, what are the 3 errors of Vatican II? Or, list 5 reasons that the Latin Mass is better than the Novus Ordo, or something like that, right? So if we want to talk about mind-altering techniques, right? I know that phrase sounds kind of scary, but when you apply it, it's just this. It's keeping your mental it's keeping track of your mentality. It's forming your mind according to their principles, right? And like I said, they're very easily refuted if you just put in the time and research. But when you show them, papal condemnations or historical evidence or parallels or any kind of refutation to these things, they get furious. They feel it's like they're a cornered animal. Like they get so upset and they lash out and they won't engage in meaningful critical conversation. There's no questioning.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, it's so true. I love how you're kind of fleshing this one out. Because when I first read it, I thought, well, mind-altering methods, so that sounds kind of like, almost sci-fi. Like, does that one really apply? But like what you're saying, too, about them inventing their own definitions in order to support their opinions. It's like the way they have literally tried to redefine schism in order to support their claim that they're not schismatic. But their definition is completely erroneous when you line it up with the way the church has always defined schism. It's absolutely obvious, but you'd have to go look that up to realize the irony of what they're doing. They're not actually answering the argument. They're not refuting it. They're just saying, oh, well, that's how you define schism, but this is the way I define it. And then everybody in that group is expected to fall into line.
Right. Yep. If you look up historical parallels, if you look up the circumstances of previous schisms, how people saw schism in the past and what that entailed, and it's like you said, it's so obvious. But yeah, they've redefined the word so that they can fit it into their boxes, into their criteria, right? So,
and if you hear something said over and over enough times, you start to believe it, especially if it's being said by people that you're told are trustworthy and you've never really encountered anything else. And I find that happens a lot of times when I'm talking to trads who make reference to things like the Ottaviani intervention or, the Divine Mercy, the Diary of St. Faustina is full of terrible things, whatever. And I'm like, did you actually read those books? Did you actually research that yourself? And they're like, no. They get this look kind of like, well, so many people told me that I thought
Mhm.
it must be true. I'm like, well, it's not.
Right, right. It just takes a very small amount of research to show that, maybe these things don't hold the credibility that they thought it did. So, right.
Okay.
So then number four is I kind of combined two of them here. It's that us versus them mentality or fear or rejection of the outside world, right?
Hmm.
It's the CEI expounded on this and said they have cults have unreasonable fear about the outside world and its impending catastrophe or evil conspiracies or persecutions. I mean, again, I read that and I said that hit the nail on the head, right? And as the respondents all said, they get sucked into every conspiracy theory. They said talk of hell is predominant in many households and every admonishing sermon. Someone said anything or anybody outside the SSPX was evil, and we were discouraged from even meeting and being friends with those people. Um, they said the community keeps itself very separate from the rest of society because they see themselves as better, and they constantly preach the dangers of the world. Right? That's the big phrase that I've heard as well. Someone said they fostered this idea of separation from the church by calling it the Conciliar Church. Right? There aren't just Catholics anymore. There's Novus Ordo Catholics, and they're to the SSPX. They're essentially Protestants. Right?
Right.
Um, Let me see if there's anything else on here. One person said that she was speaking to a friend who she said, we can't stay in our little bubble our whole lives. And her friend said, isn't it better to be in a bubble so that we can protect our kids from the evils of the outside world? I mean, I'll pull that back to your example of that movie, The Village, at the beginning. That's, yeah, the parallels are striking. There is definitely this they and I think this opens up a bigger conversation too of they I think put too much stock in the crisis being the fault of one specific thing, one very tangible thing, and they don't stop to consider that it may just be human beings. It may just be fallen human beings with sinful tendencies. And like in that movie,
Right.
there's tragedy at the end because human beings are human beings, and jealousy and strife gets in the way. It has nothing to do with the unfortunate experiences you had, right? It's to do with
Right.
just human nature. um, so I mean, I have a quote from Archbishop Lefebvre here to start it off. He
Yeah.
straight up says, he says, we are against the Conciliar Church, which is virtually schismatic, even if they deny it. In practice, it is a church virtually excommunicated because it is a modernist church. I mean, straight from their founder himself, he says, we are against the Conciliar Church. We are against the church. I don't understand how you can read that and continue to follow something like that, right?
Right.
They as the commenter said, they rely on conspiracy theories about communists and Freemasons in the church, that the new missile is evil. I know there's a lot of even more kind of benign conspiracy theories like flat earthers and, a lot of distrust of government, distrust of the scientific community, these kinds of things. Lefebvre invoked the third secret of Fatima and the La Salette apparition. I found this interesting because, like I said, I started doing some digging into these things. Okay, number one, the third secret was not published at the time of his consecrations. He didn't know what it said. He just says it must have said this, and it must have been so bad that the Pope decided not to publish it. He didn't know what it said.
Uh,
He's invoking nothing, right? And
wow.
then the La Salette apparition has, at least the one that he cites, has been condemned by the church and placed on the index of forbidden books. But he cites
Wow.
these things in his sermon that he gave right before he illicitly consecrated 4 bishops.
Oh,
This
yeah,
is
and they're still circulating in trad world. I was just talking to a friend of mine from the society, and she said something about the third secret of Fatima, and that, and I was like, that's not in the third secret of Fatima. And she's like, what? And I said, I've read it. It's online. She's like, really? And I said, yeah. And we pulled it up on the Vatican website and I read it to her. And she was just like, wow, I'm so confused.
Mhm. Right. It's trad world is like a really, it's like the world's biggest game of telephone. where people just tell each other things and they don't track it down to the source. And then when you do, when you're playing telephone, you ask the first person, okay, what'd you say? It's very different from what it ended up, 10 people down the line. Same thing here, right? It's you hear one thing, and then when you track it down to the source, you realize, wait, that's not at all accurate. There's a really good article written for Fidelity magazine back in the 90s that I link here in this paper, and I would really recommend you read it. But a former SSPX adherent said, he said, speaking of the SSPX here, he said they didn't teach the fathers, they weren't teaching Chrysostom. The society, got too wrapped up with conspiracies in Rome, and they got too caught up with the policies of the crisis in the church, and they should have been talking about Augustine and Chrysostom and the basics of the faith. Right? They're so hung up on conspiracies and the modernism and the crisis, and so hung up on finding out these things that they can't, right? That they're not just teaching the basics of the faith, right? There's also, as is pretty public, this us versus them mentality is very present in their feud with the FSSP. And they see them as traitors or as defectors, right? They have a Facebook page called SSPX Faithful. It got 10,000 plus members. These are two of its rules, and its list of rules. It says, number one, endorsing or condoning the existence and actions of the Fraternity of St. Peter is not welcome in this group. Number two, traditional ecumenism, or the practice of accepting any organization or priest solely with the criteria that they celebrate the Latin Mass, is not welcome here. They're very blatantly, us versus them. We condemn you guys. We are our own thing. We are our own separate entity, right? I don't know if you wanted to talk about anything in there anymore.
Oh, it's so interesting that, your own experience and their education system attests to that. You mentioned that in the paper, that they didn't give you any instruction in basic theology or ecclesiology, which would have been really helpful. It's just like their package of what you need to be an equipped SSPX adherent with a flavoring of Catholicism, because what they're teaching you isn't actually Catholic. That's not how the church has traditionally educated and catechized people, especially young children, in conspiracy theories and how to sniff out a Freemason, and how to know that the new missile is evil and all these things. It's like, what? I tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't remember anybody I've ever heard of who went to a Catholic school, within the church, that was part of the curriculum or something like.
It's highly irregular, yes. And like you said, I mentioned in my education there, I didn't get any kind of theology, any kind of philosophy, but yeah, we spent a whole semester talking about the crisis in the church and why the SSPX is right. So
it seems a little desperate, because if they were so legitimate, they shouldn't have to work so hard to show how legitimate they are. It should just be obvious.
Exactly. The truth is the truth, and it can stand up to criticism, right? If they're so correct, they should be very, very content in their position. They should be very settled, but it's like they're very insecure about it. They have to constantly be defending it. They have to constantly show why it is that they're right. I think they have even a video called "Why the SSPX is Right."
Yeah. I mean, here they have an established curriculum for their schools. They're using this as part of their teaching method, and they also are preaching to families that homeschooling is wrong. You can be excommunicated or, mortally sinning if you homeschool or put your kids in any other kind of school except the SSPX schools. It seems like, the perfect indoctrination setup, doesn't it?
Right. Yep. Yeah. We have the answers. You can't find them anywhere else.
Again, they're trying to take away your free will, basically, which is something that even God doesn't do. Yes, he gave us commandments, but they weren't that specific. Sorry. Like that's getting kind of nitpicky and suspicious.
Yeah, for sure. Yep. So on to number 5, which is the accountability. The criteria is that the leader or the group is not accountable to any authorities. I don't think we need to get into huge detail on this one, because this is fairly obvious that describes them to a T. They're not, right? They have their own internal superiors, right? But they only, as we said earlier, they only exist because of disobedience to the Pope. They don't obey the lawful church authorities. The priests don't obey the lawful bishops of the diocese, right? Their own bishops don't have authority to send priests to minister anywhere, because a bishop who has the mark of the the episcopal character but not the authority cannot just send a priest to minister wherever he pleases. That would be, we don't even have to get into the canonical mess that would create. That would just be chaos. That's not how the church works, right?
Right.
There is no authority. They just supply jurisdiction as their authority, right? That's what that's their golden ticket, essentially. I mentioned in here that their organization only exists because of disobedience to the highest authority in the church and disregard of the penalties that were imposed because of that disobedience, right? They had the church's highest penalty, excommunication, imposed on them, and they disregarded it. There's nothing, what else can you do? Right. I mean, I've never heard them admit that any kind of penalty or any kind of reprimand applies to them. They always just say, nope, it doesn't apply. No, we're actually, what we're doing is true obedience, and what everyone else is doing is really disobedience, right?
They literally laughed it off. They're like, oh, what church is excommunicating us? The church is excommunicating itself because we're the ones holding to the true faith. I mean, that letter that after Lefebvre's excommunication, that was it 12 different priests of the society wrote together, basically like this open letter, here, Rome, here's what we think about your latest move. Mm-hmm. They said in there that it was like a mark of pride to them that they would be singled out for the penalty of excommunication, because it showed that the church was so wrong and they were so right.
Right. I think they described it as a badge of honor or something like that.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, I should link that in this. I'll try to link that in the description below.
Yeah, that would be helpful. There is a quote I'll present here from Lefebvre. He says, "Inasmuch as the present Roman authorities are imbued with ecumenism and modernism, and that their decision and the new law are as a whole influenced by these false principles, we must institute authorities to supply for these deficiencies." Listen to this again. We must institute authorities, which again, he says, which faithfully adhere to Catholic tradition. Again, it's authority that adheres to tradition, right? Our interpretation of tradition. I mean, I would think that they would want to distance themselves from language like that, him admitting that we're going to set up our own authorities. But there it is.
Right.
So that's, they have nobody that they answer to. Their priests do not answer to the lawful bishop of the area. Their bishops don't answer to the Pope because they only are bishops because of disobedience to him, right?
Right. They only contact the Holy See when they potentially could gain some kind of advantage from it. But when they want to do something like, we referenced earlier, their own marriage tribunals, they release people from ecclesiastical penalties and religious vows on their own without any extension to the rest of the church to make sure that's okay. I mean, they have no authority to be doing these things, but they just said, on our own word, we need to be here, so we're going to do these things. And that's totally a parallel church.
Yep, that is as I believe St. Francis de Sales describes it, a rival altar, a parallel altar, which is just, again, not how the Catholic Church operates. That wounds the church. That harms the unity of the church. That doesn't make any sense.
Absolutely.
There is a really great quote that I wanted to share, because a lot of the time you'll hear, and this is more kind of for the laity than the actual priests, but the laity all the time will say, oh no, we do submit to the lawful authority. We submit to the bishop because we say his name in the mass, right? We acknowledge his authority, right? I found a quote from St. Ignatius of Antioch. This is around the year 100 AD, right? He says, "It is fitting then not only to be called Christians, but to be so in reality, as indeed some give one the title of bishop, but do all things without him. Now such persons seem to me to be not possessed of a good conscience, seeing that they are not steadfastly gathered together according to the commandment."
Oh,
I think St. Ignatius shuts that argument down almost 2,000 years ago.
Yeah. There's nothing new under the sun. Like, the church knows their game. That's why Pope John Paul II wrote in Ecclesia Dei what he did about their actions and what they consisted of, and calling it what it was, and then giving it the appropriate punishment. And that letter is just disputed and completely dismissed by the society ever since, like it was never written.
Yep, exactly. So, yep, and then we'll go down here to number 6, which is the fear of leaving, or shunning those who do leave, disconnecting from those who do leave. This one, again, is very well attested to people on your channel and by people who have written their accounts about this. But, people responded that you're completely disowned if you leave, you're shunned if you leave. They said anyone who leaves is forgotten and dismissed, and the general explanation for their leaving is that they were disobedient or rebellious, which again is so ironic. Somebody said there's nothing subtle about the treatment of those who leave their group. People who leave face the real possibility of losing family, friends, and even sometimes their jobs and a spouse over a break with the SSPX. One person was very, very vulnerable and shared. She said, when my husband and I made the decision to leave the SSPX, I cried the whole day, not because I didn't want to leave, but because I was terrified of the backlash that we'd receive.
Wow.
Somebody said, if family members or friends doubt the theology of the SSPX or leave it, they're told to cut them off for the good of their souls. They said, we pray for them to come to the true faith, but we do not associate with them.
Wow.
I'll go to another quote from Stephen Hassan, which I thought was very good. He said, family ties can enforce silence on disbelieving second-generation members. He says, it's easier to go along with a cult than express their true opinions. One person said, and I know this, or I hope at least that this isn't the norm, but one person said they heard someone one time make a comment that they said, my dad would beat me with a belt if I ever opposed the SSPX. That's, I don't even have words for that.
Wow. Your dad would beat you with a belt.
Yep. I hope that's not,
wow.
I hope that's a very rare case. I hope that's not normal, but the fact that someone did say that is very troubling. I know, as people have said on your channel, they're afraid to share with people. I think I've heard your guests say that they hope that their family members don't find their videos or don't find their interviews because they don't want to deal with family tensions. This is a very common thing. You can hear this from many people who have left, is that, you're shunned, you're disconnected, family doesn't talk to you, friends don't talk to you. This is, it doesn't take much research to find that one, it does hold up. Another one
and it lasts for years after you leave. It doesn't just blow away once you've made the jump. It takes a very long time. I wonder if people ever can fully shake that fear and dread.
Yeah, it's a lot to deal with. They have just constantly, they'll get berated and told that they're risking their souls and all these kinds of things. I put in a paper here, I've heard an SSPX priest from the pulpit, I heard him say, he said, people don't stop to think what God thinks of them when they leave the SSPX. Like, instilling this guilt in them of, like, that God is judging you for leaving us. That's just terrible.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, how could they not think about it after all the conditioning they've been through? They thought about it, and they were so terrified and miserable that they decided they would leave anyway and risk the consequences.
Mm-hmm. Yep, 100%.
Wow.
So down to our next one here, how the followers or the adherents are controlled by shame or guilt. They are, and it says, the leadership induces these feelings to influence or control members. One person said, yep, from the time you're a little kid, they said you are never good enough and most likely will never be good enough unless you become a priest or religious. Someone said the general impression given is that there's no salvation outside the SSPX, right? That outside of us, as they say again in their response about being a cult, anything outside our boundaries is compromised, right? You'll be risking your soul if you leave. One person said, always told you can only have true happiness if you follow tradition, or the SSPX. One person said, if you left, you're immediately assumed to be a bad person. They use fear and peer pressure to make sure that no one leaves, and if they do, they're painted as under the influence of the devil. So There was another very good quote. Sorry, I'm kind of jumping all around here, but
Oh yeah.
there was another very good quote from that book, Wounded Faith, that said, God is often portrayed in abusive groups as a vengeful, wrathful, punishing God whom the members must somehow placate, and they experience fear and performance-based insistence that leads to submission to the leader who claims to hold the key to members' acceptance by God. Right. So, and then they say they have difficulty leaving because their fear is that by leaving, that means they're leaving God himself. I mean, that quote that
Wow.
I gave completely backs that up, right? You hear it all the time in their circles, right? The love of God and the joy of the faith is not the motivating factor in SSPX circles, right? The motivator is don't do that because it's a mortal sin, or don't do that because you'll go to hell, or don't dress that way because you're causing people to sin, right?
Right. Right.
They're
Yeah,
obsessed with,
scrupulosity is rife in the SSPX. People are just, they're always afraid because hell is literally around every corner. So you have to be afraid that every little thing you do could be mortal and grave and dangerous. So yeah, how can you live like that constantly on an adrenaline high? Like you're always just barely getting by and hoping that the axe doesn't fall on you. You deserve it every minute. It's like, wow. Yeah.
right, right. You're under constant anxiety and constant pressure and constant scrupulosity. I agree. Those are huge problems in traditionalist circles. They also they invent, I mean, to put it bluntly, they invent sins, right? I mean, the chief one, we all know, they all say, it's a sin to go to the new mass. Setting aside the complete theological incoherence of that statement, right?
Right.
They instill it into people from the time they're a little kid that yes, you can only go to our churches, right? Even when you're traveling, if there's only a fraternity church in the area, even though it's a Latin mass, they'll say, well, we'll leave that to your discretion, right? We'll leave that one up to you. I mean, that's what they say in their public facing material anyway. From the pulpit and in the classroom, they'll tell you absolutely no, you can't go. But,
Yeah.
in their public facing stuff, they'll say, don't go to the new mass. I mean, I've seen examinations of conscience that they print and they sell where it says, did I attend the new mass, listed as sins in there. I know those are making the rounds on the internet. They say that, as you
Yeah.
said at the beginning, that it's wrong to homeschool your kids. They say it's a sin for women to wear pants. They say all these things that they just make up faults and they make up transgressions to keep people in line. It's yeah.
Yeah. I know people who treat the daily rosary like it's a sin if they don't say it. I mean, I don't know if you press them specifically, would they say, yes, I believe it's a sin, but they act like it. Like they're ashamed if they had such a crazy day and they didn't have a chance to say the rosary or they forgot. They just beat themselves up for it. And I'm like, the rosary is an optional devotion. Like it's great, but I don't think God wants you to feel that much guilt and shame, if any, over missing one day of praying the rosary.
Right. Exactly. Yep. It's a devotional. It's just a prayer. That sounds like I'm belittling it. I'm not. I'm not saying it's just a prayer, but it's it's nowhere near on par with the mass, for example. And and we know about these people. I don't know how much is connected to SSPX circles, but we all know about these people who will just stay home and pray a rosary instead of if there's no like Latin mass in the area.
Yeah.
Yeah, they treat it like this just yeah. I mean, like you said, it's another way of inducing guilt and shame into them. It's all these things that they say are wrong or imply that are wrong, right?
Right. Right.
So yep, and then down to our next one here about how there are similar experiences from former members, how they all relate the same stories of abuse and the same kind of grievances. There was one statement from respondents here that I thought was very, I mean, it was very sad, but very poignant. They said, the fact that there is an entire community of ex-SSPX members who all share the same experiences and literal trauma, some with a diagnosed PTSD from their time in the SSPX, answers this question very well. Someone
Yeah.
said, every person I've talked to, listened to, or read comments from who has left the SSPX has similar experiences and opinions as I do about the things that ultimately led us to leave. I have a priest friend who described St. Mary's as a pressure cooker. I thought that I thought that maybe these things were just local to St. Mary's, right? Because it's all contained in this tiny little town. But then, hearing people on your channel who are from, all over the country, and and reading stuff online that people have posted, people have entire blogs dedicated to all these, terrible things that happen. I said that this isn't just a localized thing. This is organization wide, right? If you run a Google search for just SSPX cult, you'll find, like I said, blog posts, you'll find Reddit threads, you'll find podcasts, you'll find video interviews. Yours will be on there, obviously, and all of them line up with these criteria, right? It's this fear-based control of staying in the group. It's fear of asking questions. It's fear of leaving. It's that there's no truth, or you're compromising if you leave. I mean, I've confirmed, as I say in the paper, I've confirmed with a licensed clinical counselor who specializes in religious trauma that the SSPX does exhibit the problematic patterns of a cult. I mean, I got the rubber stamp on that one.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I interviewed an investigative reporter one time. She said she's had contacts from all over the world about issues in the SSPX, and she said they all tell her how cultish it is, and she was surprised at first, but now she just isn't, because she learned that it's literally a universal element that she gets feedback on worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Yep. It's organization wide.
Right.
So yeah, our next one here about the ends justify the means. I mean, that should be a pretty self-explanatory one. That they can transgress the law, they can circumvent, as we said earlier, canonical penalties. The ends, which is the salvation of souls, right? Salvation of souls is the ultimate end. It justifies anything they do, right? They can disobey any law. They can go wherever they please. They can minister to whomever they decide they need to minister to. They have, I mean, honestly, I can't think of any boundaries that they have, right? There's nowhere that they won't go. There's nothing that they won't do. They have very explicitly said in that video I mentioned earlier, the one called "Why the SSPX is Right." One of the questions posed to them was, well, what happens if the bishop tells you to leave? What if he says, I don't like you guys, you need to get out? I mean, kudos to them for their honesty, but they said, yeah, we would just say no. We don't have to listen to them.
Yeah.
We're going to do what we want to do, right? There's a great sermon on YouTube called "The Marks of a Cult" from one of the Franciscan Friars of the Immaculate. He had a quote specifically about them in there. He said, in a cult, the ends justify the means. For example, the SSPX would like to preserve what they call the true church, which is a good end. But the means that they use to reach that end is by celebrating 5 of the 7 sacraments illicitly, because the priests in the SSPX have a suspension ad divinis, which means they can't celebrate sacraments publicly or privately, except for hearing confessions and witnessing marriages. And they can't even witness marriages in all dioceses, right? One of their crisis
if
videos,
they are denied permission, if they're denied permission in a particular diocese, they go ahead and celebrate the marriages anyway. To them, it's just like, a regulation they're kind of falling in step with. But if they're denied, they just do what they want.
Yep, exactly. I found a really great quote from Blessed Pope Pius IX from his from Quartus Supra from 1873. I thought this paralleled their position very well, and I thought it was worth including. So he's talking about the Armenians, and he says, they argue that the sentence of schism and excommunication pronounced against them was unjust and consequently void of strength and influence. They have claimed also that they are unable to accept the sentence because the faithful might desert to the heretics if deprived of their ministration. These novel arguments were wholly unknown and unheard of by the ancient fathers of the church. I mean, that's from the late 1800s, and he's again pretty much describing the SSPX exactly.
Wow.
I don't know how, again, you can, as I mentioned earlier, when you present historical evidence or historical parallels, they'll say, oh, no, that doesn't count, right? Like, I know one that they'll often cite is when you show them Pope Pius XII said that any episcopal consecration without a mandate from the Holy See results in automatic excommunication. And they'll say, no, 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 that doesn't apply because he was talking about the church in China. And it's like the circumstances doesn't matter. This is, or don't matter. This is a law for the church. This doesn't mean this group specifically, right?
It's the principle of the matter. The details are not really relevant. So,
right.
Well, I mean, they like to use that analogy of to kind of support this, their ends justify the means thing of if your neighbor's house is on fire and, you think somebody's in there, or, you want to make sure everybody's okay and you want to help them, you can break the rule, the law of no trespassing on someone else's property and run into that house, to save somebody or something precious inside that they would want you to save. And so he's like, you're breaking a law in order to do a good thing. But I'm like, but that's a penal law. When you break a penal law, you're risking the consequences, but you're not transgressing the moral order. Even breaking, to speed, if you're getting someone to the hospital, that's another penal law. It's not even, it's like, yeah, speeding in a neighborhood is dangerous. Okay, so you are putting people at risk there. But if you're just out on the open road, you're basically just like, if you choose to do that and risk getting a ticket, that's your choice. But it's not of the same nature as what we're dealing with here. That if they're actually in schism, that is a serious wound inflicted on the body of Christ. That's not. Yeah, that's not just like it's kind of a technicality, It's like, no, that's actually like really harming. And it's like cutting a limb off of the church. You're like dismembering the body of Christ according to your understanding of how bad things are. It's like, wow, okay, so it's good to just cut off a member because you judge the rest of the body is so diseased, it's going to affect that member eventually. Well, guess what? If you cut a member off, that member is going to die. So now you've sinned against your own, the people that you're claiming to preserve and protect. You cut off all grace to them. And so you're going to shrivel up their souls, but by golly, you're going to be standing on your little rock saying, we were right,
Right, exactly, right. Like you said, this is a matter of the essential constitution of the church. This is a matter of the church's very nature. This is not just a technicality or like you said, a penal law, right? This is the very nature of the church. You can't, there's no circumstance that justifies transgressing that, right? There's a letter, I believe in a letter to Lefebvre from Pope Paul VI. Yeah, he said, stop inflicting wounds on the body of Christ. I think he summed it up very well there. He's saying you're causing division, you're causing rupture. You are, and as they'll even admit today, they'll say, yes, of course we work in opposition to the bishops of the church. Yes, of course we carry out our mission opposed to the will of the church. Of course we do that. Again, they wear it like a badge of honor.
Well, I love what Andrew Bertel said in his debate with Jeff Kassman about those analogies and how they fall short. He said, really what the society is doing, it's like you have someone in the car to get to the hospital. You're like running somebody over in order to get that person to the hospital quicker. So you're inflicting damage of a very serious kind. Yeah, beyond a technicality, you're actually maiming somebody in order to save somebody else. You consider that's what you have to do, but it's like nowhere in the moral law is that justified. You can't use that excuse. So, yeah.
Right. I'll take just a brief second here as a segue, because you mentioned Jeff Kassman and his public defense of the SSPX, right? I was very amused when in his debate with Peter Diamond about sedevacantism. So he also quotes Quartus Supra against the sedevacantist position, so clearly he's read it. But this is a line from Quartus Supra. I'm going to read this. He says, consequently, the bishop is in the church and the church in the bishop, and whoever is not with the bishop is not in the church. The preceding sentence as well. For the church consists of the people in union with the priest and the flock following its shepherd. He uses this as an attack against sedevacantism, somehow missing that the organization he follows is guilty of exactly the same thing. Right. Our next one here is an elitist mentality. This is this is a point specifically from the ICSA that says the group is elitist, claiming a special exalted status for itself, its leader, or its members. Or, one of its examples it gives is that the group or the leader is on a special mission to save humanity, right? Again, hit the nail on the head. One person very summarized very well in a response. They said, "You don't get much more elitist than claiming your founder is the sole savior of the entire Catholic Church." I mean, yep, that should be all you need there, really. I mean, we've all seen it. They say Archbishop Lefebvre is a saint, that they're the faithful remnant of the church. They consider themselves better than all the other Catholics. They believe they're the only true group of Catholics left, and all the other Christians or Catholics are wrong. A good quote from that book, Wounded Faith, to back it up here, it says, "The more elite a church is, the more likely that abuse can occur. When church leaders believe they and their church have exclusive knowledge of true Christianity and its doctrine and structure, or they claim that others within Christianity are not as faithful, this attitude of elitism can be a breeding ground for other extreme forms of behavior." So, they're using more generic language there for Christianity. This book is written from more of a non-denominational point of view, but a lot of the things are very applicable here. I have a picture included in this paper of the sealing of the Immaculata, and it has an icon or a picture painted on a ceiling of that church building, the Immaculata itself, as Noah's Ark with the rainbow over it, as if to imply that they are the faithful remnants. Everyone else has perished. They are carrying on the only remaining life in the church, or whatever. I mean, we can be generous and try to apply this to just typology and say maybe they're just saying the church is the ark, right? But I think that's being a little too generous. This seems pretty explicit. I mean, I've shown several people this picture, and they've said, "Yeah, no, that very clearly looks like they're saying their church is the ark," right? Again, I'll reference their crisis series. One of their priests says, if you really want to oppose the present crisis in the church at its root and its causes, then where you should be is with the Society of St. Pius X. That's where every Catholic should be. I mean, as you said earlier, they discourage homeschooling. I heard a sermon one time where they said, obviously you don't send your kids to public school. You don't send them to a Novus Ordo school because they're probably going to be deficient in the, religion areas. Can't homeschool, so you got to send them to our school because we have the best option, right? And this is the section of the paper that you mentioned earlier about the kind of quasi-Gnostic attitude, right? Where for those who don't know, Gnosticism is this like hidden knowledge, secret knowledge, right? And they kind of exhibit this attitude that the true tradition or the true faith is something that is hidden, or that only they have and other people need to discover it, right? So it's not enough to just be, go through RCIA and get baptized and join your local parish. You have to keep hunting it down. You have to, go on, weird websites, and you have to follow all these traddy pundits and all these figures to figure out where the true faith is, instead of the conciliar church or the modernist church, right? And then the last thing here, I thought this was a really applicable quote from Stephen Hassan's book, Combating Cult Mind Control. He says, as a community, cult members feel they have been chosen by God, history, fate, or some other supernatural force to lead humanity out of darkness into a new age of enlightenment. They say cult members have a great sense not only of mission, but also of their special place in history, and they believe they'll be recognized for their greatness for generations to come. This absolutely accurate here, right? You hear it all the time. Rome will thank us one day. Archbishop Lefebvre even said that himself. And they say that, that he'll be declared a saint or a doctor of the church, even that they're preserving true tradition again in this crisis. And then one day, when the church comes to its senses, they will be the saviors of the church, right? They are the ones who upheld true tradition, and they are going to be recognized for their efforts, even though they've been persecuted. They have this persecution complex. They're going to be the ones who saved the church, essentially.
Wow. Well, let's hope they're right, because if they're wrong and that isn't how it ends up, then they've just led every faithful Catholic out of the church into nothing, and that's going to be writing on their heads.
Right. Yep.
Oh man.
So our next one is records of historical abuse. There are records, news articles, books, documents about the abuses of the group leader or the problems of the group or the leader. Um, those two articles that I mentioned in Fidelity magazine back in the 90s, those are very, very good. They are quite extensive. As we all know, Church Militant has a pretty huge database of stories on them. I know I've heard people have their grievances with Church Militant. I'm not going to comment on that, but they do provide links. They do provide recorded phone calls. They do provide emails. They provide content and sources, right? So, it's pretty hard to refute hard evidence like that.
Right.
There is a quote from one of those Fidelity articles that I just wanted to read because I thought it applied very well. They said, if you've read previous articles describing pernicious cults, you'll recognize all the marks of a cult in the fortress at St. Mary's. A 10-year-old boy was brought to the clinic for a checkup, and the doctor told the mother, if I thought it would do any good, I'd turn you in for child abuse if you send that boy back to St. Mary's. The parents removed the boy from St. Mary's and placed him in public school, even though the priests taught that the children sent to public school would go to hell. Psychological tests given public school entrance revealed the boy was so traumatized he was judged unable to function in a classroom setting, and the family has now left the society and left town. I mean, these kids are psychologically traumatized. These kids have difficulty functioning in just regular environments, right? I know there's a reporter from the Topeka Capital Journal, which is, Topeka is close to St. Mary's. They've done a couple of articles on there. They are behind a paywall, but, you can get to them describing some issues with them in the early 2000s. But yeah, I mean, the Cult Education Institute has all these articles about them in the 80s. They've got these articles from Fidelity in the 90s. There's these articles from the Topeka Capital Journal, early 2000s. There's all these Church Militant ones. They've consistently been problematic, right?
Right.
And Father John Rizzo is a great resource for those because he's cited in those articles in Fidelity. He was interviewed by Church Militant. He has some inside knowledge because he was with them for a time. So one of those articles is specifically about him, and I would really recommend that people read that.
Oh man, that sounds good. It also reminds me too of a guy that I know who moved his family to St. Mary's from another part of the country, and they were just so enchanted with the society, and they thought, well, we've got to be here, and they befriended one of the priests, and it ended up that priest sort of judged that the husband was trouble because he wasn't just an unquestioning adherent, but the wife was. So the priest got very close with the wife, and then with the help of some other people in the parish, convinced her to divorce her husband and get custody of the children, which the husband is still fighting to this day. He's trying to save his family. He wants to be with his wife and his kids, but it's been a totally uphill battle. And he called the first lawyer's office he called. That lawyer just listened to his story, and he goes, oh yeah, I've heard all this before. I have 6 or 7 other clients with the exact same situation as you.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's like there's actually like a system in place, if you will, it's like if they recognize somebody problematic, they can extract them from the family and remove them because they can get such control over the other members that they can keep them there. I mean, I've heard other stories similar too, even like physically making it hard for them to leave town if a family is trying to leave, or just the fact that, the society, especially in that area, owns so many of the businesses or the big factory, and they know so much about, everyone who's working there, and they kind of control them or pressure them sometimes because they have this control. And it's like, oh, you thought it was a good idea to move to this community that was going to support you in your faith. But actually, it's like if at some point you decided there was a problem and you wanted to get out, they may actually make it hard or impossible for you to do so.
Yeah. Yep. I've heard very similar things. Yep. So yeah,
right.
brings us to our last point here, which is about leadership dictating the rules in great detail. They dictate how members, the point here is that they dictate how members should think, act, and feel. They must have permission to date or to change jobs or to get married. They prescribe what kind of clothes you need to wear, whether or not to have children, how to discipline your children. A lot of these things sound very applicable here. I know, again, listening to your interviews, that the issues of modesty in women's clothes is huge, right? That is a huge thing with them. They're constantly talking about, how people dress and how people present themselves. I know people have had their parents have had to give them permission to get married. I talked to one person who said when he was in the SSPX, he no longer is, but he said that their attitude was kind of one of, let us do your thinking for you, because you'll be tricked into succumbing to modernism, right? A lot of the feedback I got from former adherents on this point was about, the women's dress and disciplining for violating the dress code, right? So that's kind of the main one, but I know there are other points like that of, whether or not to have children. I know they're very involved to a very unnecessary degree of, offering unsolicited advice on whether you should be having more kids, or, why the size of your family, and if you're allowed to use NFP and all these kinds of things. I know that's also a very prevalent thing. I don't know if you want to talk about that at all.
Oh, yeah, we covered that a little bit in the women's panel video that we just did about women in traditionalism. And yeah, they discourage NFP as, basically quote unquote Catholic birth control. And even though the magisterial documents of the church have allowed for it, and from my reading of them, they never stipulate that you have to get permission from a church official before you practice it. It's left up to the discernment of the couple. But in the SSPX, their approach is that you have to get a permission from your priest. And honestly, I'm like, okay, you can tell a priest a lot about your marriage situation, but at the same time, he's not in it, and he doesn't know you as well as you know each other as spouses. So there's a lot of wisdom to why the church would leave that ultimate decision up to the couples. And yeah, we talked about there's also like getting permission to marry. You mentioned that in the opening paragraph. That's one of the parts of the definition. And even when it comes down to who to marry, because I know someone who was told to break up with her boyfriend, even though he was a faithful SSPX attendee. The priest he said, he's not right for you, and you have to break up with him, and you need to take me as your spiritual director and spend more time with me. And we were discussing this situation one day in front of another friend who immediately piped up and said, oh, I know of a dozen other situations where the exact same thing happened. And then yet another one, in my interview with Bethany, she said the same thing had happened to her. She describes a very traumatizing experience in confession where the priest was demanding that she break up with her boyfriend, and he refused to give her absolution until she would comply. And she was sweating and having a panic attack, and she just fell silent until he just got worn out, I guess, of trying to convince her, and finally just gave in and gave her absolution, and she left. And she's like, I can never go back to that church again. It was such an awful experience. And so it's like, again, they want to have so much control. I mean, like the first lady who ended up marrying the guy that the priest told her not to marry, they are married to this day and have a very happy marriage and wonderful children. It's like, there was no apparent reason why he should be giving her that counsel. The church has never inserted herself into.
Right.
I mean, arranged marriages they're handled within a family and a culture, not within a religious organization.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So
Right.
that is the last of the main points. There is a letter that was published in 2009 on Dr. Jeff Mears' website, Catholic Culture. It's a little bit longer, but I do want to read the whole thing because it's a really great case study on how, again, this stuff is prevalent everywhere, right? This person, I don't know if the person who wrote this letter, I don't know where they were raised. I don't know, I don't know what kind of, which community they were in, but inevitably, when people talk about their experience in the SSPX, they hit many of these points. This person said, when I got married 2 years ago, I was fed up with the way my family and the priests were trying to manipulate me and the way they treated my fiance. My fiance was a devout Catholic, not SSPX, however, not anti-SSPX at all. They treated him very well while he was doing his research on the situation, but when he finally came to his conclusion that he wasn't comfortable receiving sacraments from the SSPX, instead of respecting his decision, they turned very sour, right? So note that this is, the group is always right. You should be with us, right? So then she goes on to say, I was very confused about how a good Catholic who had a simple, beautiful faith was suddenly a danger to me, right? Again, point number 4 about us versus them. He's a danger. He's compromised. You will compromise if you go with him, this kind of thing. So she says, when we decided to get married by a local diocesan priest in the traditional rite, the SSPX priests were very angry. When I was asked why by one priest, I said very politely that it was our decision, as that is what we were most comfortable with. I didn't want to be disrespectful, as I believe SSPX adherents have the right to make their own choices, as I should be able to make mine. I was shocked when the priest told me off for being ungrateful to my schooling and to my parents. Right? So they're again demonstrating this, like, you have to be committed to our group. They're shaming this person. They're controlling them by guilt. Why are you ungrateful? You're making them feel guilty about going against their education, their parents, right? She says, many of the new generation Y of SSPX are losing the faith. Among my friends, few know who the current pope is, let alone who their local bishop is. Many have had enough of the SSPX's rigid, strict ways, especially regarding women, for the strictness of dress. 1 inch too short and you're told you're immodest, right? Again, going back to the dress, the detailed rules from leadership. And then her last point here, it's sad when you hear so many young people complain about how crazy the SSPX is and that they're only attending mass there to keep their parents happy. So that, I think, goes back to Stephen Hassan's point about how, second generation members, disbelieving second generation members, they just say, well, it's easier to just go along and get along. It's easier to just do it and not stir the pot. But, even 2009, this was almost 15 years ago, and this random person said, they're only going there to keep their parents happy. They don't want to be there. People are tired of it. So I was just amazed. I just stumbled across that letter, and I was going down through her statements and had this list off to the side, and I said, yep, she's checking quite a few of these points here. So So the only statement that surveyees did not agree with on my survey here is that the group is occupied with bringing in new members, right? So they said the SSPX prefers to kind of isolate itself and wait for people to come to them. And then there's this kind of, I guess, trial period of, like, you have to work your way in and you have to slowly show people that you're acceptable or that you will follow their ways and their ideology, right? But again, as we've seen in this paper, as we've seen in many interviews, as we've seen in a lot of recorded stuff, those who have left all agree that these things happen, right? These are not isolated incidents. And I don't know how much of it is specific to certain areas. I don't know if, for example, again, with like St. Mary's being so contained that maybe the strictness of the dress code is worse there. I couldn't say, but these criteria, again, are all attested to by people who have left, right? So this is very clearly is a group that reveres their founder and their current leaders above the lawful authorities of the church. They discourage dissent and questioning from their beliefs. They, by their own admission, they work in opposition to the church. They are opposed to the church. They convince their members that the faith is compromised or even absent outside of their structures, right? And they shame people who leave. They cut off people who leave. I don't know how you can read those and not say it's a cult, right? I mean, you can search many specialists, many experts in the field, and all of these things will line up with the generally understood criteria in the field of cult studies, right? And all of them are undeniably present. Undeniably. I don't understand people who, there was one person who got a hold of one of my survey links. They're a current SSPX attendee, and they went down the entire thing and said no. They said every single thing that said no, this doesn't apply. And I said, well, that's not entirely surprising because they won't see it. But those who have left, all of them said, again, almost universally, yes,
Right.
the SSPX meets these criteria, right? So
Right.
for those people who are listening or watching and insist that maybe these don't apply or these are not accurate, right? I'm
Right.
glad you haven't been subject to these things. I really am. But it's quite clear that many people have. It's very well documented that many people have, right? And I think,
Absolutely.
as we said at the beginning, attending one of their chapels for the last couple of years, I don't think is enough to form a very well-rounded evaluation of the group, right? This is from people who have been in them in their circles for 10, 20, 30 years, and they're all saying the same thing, right? And
Yeah.
one point that you hear a lot is that they say, well, abuse happens everywhere, right? This kind of stuff happens everywhere. I want to say, yes, these things happen elsewhere, but the SSPX perpetuates an environment where this kind of stuff can thrive, right? Like,
Right.
sure, there is scandal and abuse in the church, but there are steps that have been taken and there are policies that have been instituted to deal with that kind of thing. And if you look at the trends of these, reported cases and all that, it's it's gone way down. I mean, these things have been addressed, policies have been instituted for these things. There's none of that in the SSPX because they don't have to answer to anybody. So
Right.
I would say, yeah, it's just there is abuse elsewhere, but in the SSPX, there are no steps taken to address it. It thrives. There's nothing done to address these things.
Right.
So
Yeah.
right.
And their organization is rife with clericalism. It's how they preserve that, the Gnostic idea of the elite and the leadership and the, unfailing, unquestioning obedience. And we're the true faith, we're the preservers, we're the saviors. So everybody so reveres the priest and the bishop. So when allegations come out against them, many people won't even believe them. And they'll call the victims liars because they're like, how could a priest who says the Latin Mass be guilty of something like that? That terrible child, that lying person that, maybe we've always known them to be trustworthy, but now they're definitely lying. It's really a very unhealthy environment, and they perpetuate that because it serves their ends of creating this very convincing facade. And I also just want to say, for people who have grown up within the society and who have not experienced life in the wider church, these criteria that we've just discussed of cultishness, they don't exist in the wider church. You may find the rare, community where maybe the pastor is kind of pulling certain things like this, but it's never so pronounced and it is not widespread. It is discouraged in the church. These things are not common and they're not typical. So if that's the reality you've always known, know that it is not like that in the rest of the church. And whatever they tell you about, people in the church, the Novus Ordo church, they'll look happy, but inside they're miserable. And you will be too if you join them. That is a fear tactic to discourage you. It's not true.
Right.
Yeah.
Again, it's that is keeping you in line by fear and by anxiety and by worry that you are,
Right.
yeah, you'll be losing something or you'll be compromising something if you are to leave. And you're absolutely right. These things do not exist. As you said, maybe in very rare individual cases, but by and large, the spirit of joy and peace in submission to authority and in being close knit and being together in the body of Christ, right? That brings just a very a very noticeable piece of soul that you just don't get when you're in this group where you constantly have to defend yourself and explain why what you're doing, while normally would be very wrong, in this case is actually correct, right? I can't imagine the mental stress of having to do that for your entire life, of constantly having to be in defense mode instead of just being at peace, being with Mother Church, right?
Right. Well, and I've also talked to people who described, like, especially who growing up in the society, the false peace that they knew, that when they would hear peace of soul, and that's what they would correlate it with. It's sort of this that there are certain moments or places where you can feel kind of calm or secure, like, well, this is the most okay I've ever been. And you think that that's the best it can be. But then when they leave this society and they come into the wider church, they experience true, profound, deep peace, like unshakable. Other things, the storm is raging around you, and inside you are completely certain and safe. And you know that God is with his church and that it isn't all your burden personally to bear on your shoulders. And they're like, now I realize, having experienced true and lasting peace, that was a false peace and calm that I experienced before in the society, but it's all I knew. So I didn't know there was anything else. But until they took that step, that brave step, and came out away from what they'd always known, they didn't know any different. And also, even the point about the liturgy, how ritualistic and kind of mesmerizing and mysterious it is, that even for people that have kind of nervous disorders and things, it creates in them this sort of calm state where they feel kind of like pacified, and they start to feel almost addicted to it. Like, I just have to get to the Latin Mass. I just have to go back there. If I don't go, I won't be able to have that. And it creates this feeling where, like, once they've broken away from it and come back to the church and, sometimes gone to the Novus Ordo or what, not like they go exclusively, but they've told me that they realized that environment was actually feeding them, creating this dependency on the ritual experience that they were having, and making them feel like it was almost like a drug. And I thought that was a very interesting thing. Not that I'm not saying that the 1962 missal, version of Mass was, that there was something fundamentally wrong with it or dangerous or druggish about it. But the way that it exists in these schismatic environments, it's being celebrated illicitly and with these very toxic attitudes and environments around it. And that, I think it's all kind of creating this concoction of potent toxicity that it's damaging people on so many levels. And it's like, instead of the tool, the gift that it was supposed to be to nourish the faith of souls, it's now being used against souls, and it's actually poisoning them against the true faith and the true church. It's being weaponized, as other people have put it. And that is a very tragic thing, because the Mass in itself was beautiful and good, and now it's really being ruined to a great extent by people who are taking advantage of it and setting it up as an idol for their followers to adhere to. Like, one of my interviewees said, when people go to the TLM so often, they're not going to cultivate a deeper relationship with Jesus. They're going to cultivate a deeper relationship with the traditional Latin Mass. And that's kind of how it's emphasized and spoken about even. And it's very dangerous. The things that these people, and that you've quoted in your paper, and there's so many more quotes that Mike didn't read. So please go read the paper and just take in everything that's in there, because there's a lot more that we didn't have time to get to. But these things that people are experiencing and talking about now are the things that your kids are going to be talking about and experiencing later. If you choose to bring them into a traditionalist environment like this, that's what they will be formed by and what will affect them. And that's at least the impression that they are more than likely going to take away from it. So that's on you. If you feel like, you have this big decision, whether you're going to move your family to one of these communities or make the switch to SSPX or sedevacantism, because I hear similar things about a lot of these sedevacantist groups, that you may have a very different experience in your church going and time there. Even if you spend the same amount of time as your kids, they aren't formed yet, and this will form them. And it will even create, psychological damage oftentimes that they could spend the rest of their life trying to sort through and understand. So it's not just this, it's not doctrine purely, or, words on paper. It's living, breathing people that are being affected at every level of their being. And some of them never heal from the wounds that are inflicted on them, or from the fear conditioning. And it can affect their ability to be close to God, to trust God. Again, it's so many people that have gone completely into despair and left all practice of the faith because they found that they couldn't sustain what they were being presented with, and it was too hopeless. They felt sure they were going to hell anyway. There's people in your paper that talk about that. They're like, hell was everywhere. We were sure we weren't even going to make it to heaven because it was such a hopeless picture. So if they managed to hang on, that's amazing, because they're basically shot in the foot from the outset.
Yeah. And I think what you mentioned also about, parents bringing their children into this environment, right? another aspect of cult research is that people who did not grow up in it and have what the experts call a pre-cult identity, they have that in the kind of on their mental back burner, right? So that if after some time in there they're dissatisfied with their experience, they have a previous identity or a previous experience to fall back on, and they'll say, okay, I can return to what I know, I can return to something that was working for me before. But if you bring your children up in this environment, if they're raised from the day they're born and they're in these circles the whole time, they don't have an identity to fall back on. They don't have anything except their mental formation in these circles, and that makes leaving so much harder. It has to get to some pretty intense or some pretty dramatic events for people to leave a lot of the time, and sometimes tragedy. And we really that has to be avoided. These things it's not a small thing, right? You have to understand what it is that this does to kids, especially even if you bring them in when they're a little older, let's say 10, 11, 12, those are the key formative years, right? They won't have the same thing that you will if you didn't grow up in that environment and came in when you were in your 30s or what have you. So yeah, that's also, I think, very important, is that you have to understand, even if you haven't experienced these things, if your kids were born into these groups, they will.
Right. What an excellent point and summary. And I just so appreciate your time put into this and collecting, organizing all of this evidence and contacting all these people, because what a resource that we can now share with others. And, even if you just take a couple things away from this video or from the paper, and honestly, we had so much to say to each other and about the paper that in probably the same time you watch this video, you could sit down and read the paper or less. So yeah, I definitely still encourage you to go read it. We will have the link where you can download it in the description below, and it's posted on the tradrecovery.com resources page. Again, tradrecovery.com is kind of the hub and the support network center for people leaving traditionalism or who are contemplating it or who have family or friends in the movement and are trying to understand it better and know how to talk to them and answer questions. So we're a community there, and Mike is on there as well, just around to answer questions and be supportive and just listen and help connect people with what's going to do them the most good. So please check that out and pray for our guest Mike today. And I'm praying for you too, and just in gratitude for your dedication to helping people that you've shown and just being there when people need to talk to you. It's been great. And I really benefit from having you in my life and helping with this apostolate. So thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you, Laura. I very much appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.